All right.
Wow. All right, everyone. Hi. Welcome back to our monthly interview with someone amazing in YWAM, someone who's carrying leadership and experience and a life that we get to glean and lean from and hear from, which is really cool. I'm Johan Alexandersson, for you who don't know me, and I'm situated in YWAM Harpenden. And then we have Tove. Where are you, Tove?
I'm in Kristiansand, or Skjærgårdsheimen, on an island outside of Kristiansand just now, TT.
I love hearing people try to pronounce Skjærgårdsheimen that are not Scandinavian. It is one of my favorite things in YWAM. It's so nice. Anyway, she is the star of the day for us is our very own Dr. Camille Bishop. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's good. Where are you calling in from?
I'm calling in from the East Coast of the United States in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Come on. All over the world. This is how we like to have it, which is really cool. But it's such a blessing to have you here with us, Camille. I've been with you when I did my master's program, and you oversaw my capstone, and we're very gracious with someone who's find it hard to study. But Camille, you have such a wonderful, beautiful heart for education and for young people and seeing people grow, which I appreciate a lot. So it's very fun to have you here.
Thank you. I feel very honored to be asked, so I'm glad to be with you guys today.
Thank you. So Camille,
go ahead.
Sorry, Johan, what do you say?
No, I said go ahead, Tove.
Thank you. So Camille, I've known you for quite some years, and it is just such a joy that I'm happy that I can also call you a friend. We were in the same master's program, even got to room with you, and I found out that I was not aware that you even speak German, and I think you're reading a German devotional, or is it Bible devotional?
It was a devotional called Ich bin bei dir.
Ich bin bei dir. Excellent. So Camille, you are a master educator. That's how I think of you. And you have a passion for passing on through not just information, but really imparting and for people to get it. So just a master educator. You have a doctorate. We'd love to hear a little bit about that as well. You're also an author. We're in this boat together, and you even interviewed me for that, your research back then, I remember. A brilliant book. We want to learn and hear a little bit about that book as well. I know you've worked for many years in Kona with the College of Education. How many years was that, Camille?
I was 8 years in Kona, and 8 years in Hawaii altogether, 6 years in Kona.
Wow. And then you did your DTS in South India? Yeah.
Christchurch, New Zealand, and South India.
And South India, yes. But that's a few years ago, 1988, I believe. Yes. Yeah. And then you had quite some time in Albania. I'd love to hear a little bit about that. It was, as the Iron Curtain was crumbling, you jumped on an opportunity in Albania, and maybe we just start there. So please just share a little bit. When I say Albania, what comes to your mind?
That's a great question. Yeah, I was working and serving in Kona at the time, and I remember in the late 80s when Lauren started talking about the Iron Curtain was going to come down, and everybody's just shaking their heads, going, "What?" And then of course the Berlin Wall fell, and then like dominoes, these different countries started getting their freedom, and Albania became the government just collapsed in August of 1991. And I was at the U of N workshop in Budapest, and we heard about this, and then Al Akimov came and spoke to us and said, "Who is God calling to Albania?" And I'll never forget it, because the Lord just spoke to me and said, "Camille, you're going to go there and you're going to lead a group of teachers." Oh. And I remember at the coffee break running over to talk to Carol Boyd, who was my director. I said, "Carol, God just told me I'm going to go to Albania." She said, "Yeah, he spoke that to me too." And all over the audience, God was just calling people to get involved with Albania. It was just it was like organic. It had just happened. The government just simply collapsed. And it wasn't violent or bloody. It just collapsed. and they had nothing. And so 6 months later, I was leading a team of teachers to Albania from the Kona base, and we had been studying about biblical education, and we did a 3-month assessment in the country of Albania. And I was reflecting this morning as I was preparing for this call, what was it like, to first arrive there? It was one of the most broken places I've ever seen. It was like going back 50 years in time. I mean, everything, the infrastructure was gone. There was limited electricity, limited water, very little food. People were chopping down all the trees, just trying to be able to have a heat source. And in every sector of society, it was just like ruins. The medical sector, the education sector, the government, everything. And so we did a 3-month assessment of the schools in this one particular region of Albania, and wrote it up, and came back to Kona. And then half of our team, we ended up moving to Germany the next year and joining what was called the Albania Encouragement Project. And we worked there. I mean, I worked there on and off then for like 5 years. It was the best missions experience of my life. It was there was all these different mission agencies were there, and then there was a tremendous unity between the mission agencies. We all shared resources, we shared people, we worked together well. It wasn't any kind of territorialism. And I worked in the public school system, couldn't mention Jesus, couldn't talk about the Bible. I was forbidden to do that, but the Lord was on the move. And we would go into the schools and teach seminars like the dignity of a child. And the teachers would come to us and say, "Where did you learn that at? We've never heard that in our whole entire lives." And we would say, "Well, if you invite us over for a coffee, we'll tell you." And so they'd invite us into their homes. We'd have a strong Turkish coffee, and we would just tell them about Jesus. And so little by little, people started giving their lives to Christ. The culture in the schools started to begin to change. There was more kindness. People were really changing, and it was noticeable. And for the first time in my life, I thought, that's what it means to see the kingdom of God come on earth as it is in heaven.
Wow.
Tangible. And I remember walking down the street one day in Pogradec, Albania, and I thought, Lord, I can't believe you've allowed me to experience this. This is absolutely amazing. And I felt like my calling became clear. I was a teacher by profession. I had come into world missions, and all of a sudden they just meshed together. And it was like a sense of, this is going to be my vocational calling. So Albania is very special to me. I have many, many fond memories. It wasn't an easy time, but I learned a lot, and it challenged me. And actually eventually led me to go back and get my doctorate, because I had so many questions about how do you disciple a nation, in a sphere, because that was the buzzword then in the mission, discipling nations. So
that's amazing.
Yeah, that is pretty amazing.
I have a lot more questions there, but I realize also I just opened the word Albania before asking would love to also hear just your broad strokes of your YWAM and your UON history.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
glad to share.
Yeah.
My God, I was part of a very dynamic Spirit-filled Baptist church here in Raleigh when I was in grad school getting my master's degree. And all they talked about was YWAM. And I never really heard about it before. And it was a singles group, about 150 of us. And every Wednesday night we met and we watched a YWAM video. And then we had prayer and worship and, openness and brokenness. It was just really classic YWAM. And I listened to, Lauren Cunningham and Joy Dawson and Dean Sherman, and I'd never heard anything like it in my whole life. And so it really stirred something in me. And I took the leap and did 2 summer of missions outreaches with YWAM in 85 and 86. And the second one, I was in Thailand, way up on the Thai-Cambodian border. And the not Cambodia, but it was the Thai-Burmese border. And I felt like the Lord spoke to me and said, "This is your last short-term outreach. Next time is going to be for keeps." So then I did my DTS and went to South India. And after that, I had taken a leave of absence from my teaching job. After that, it was so clear to me. So I went to Maui, where they were repioneering a base there. And I resigned my job from a phone booth, and I didn't come back to the mainland. I just stayed there, and I joined YWAM.
Wow.
It was a huge shock at first, but it started to open up a whole new world for me. And I had heard about the University of the Nations, but really didn't understand it. I thought it was just in Kona. And then I met a couple of people that worked in education there, like Paul Hawkins and Carol Boyd. And the Lord led me there in a couple of years. And that's when I started working for the University of the Nations. And that's when I started realizing, wow, my profession really matters. And I can be work in missions as a teacher. I never really thought that before. I thought a missionary wore a pith helmet and had a machete, and I never saw it, as something combined with a profession. Anyway, that's kind of my broad stroke of how I got in the mission. Yeah.
Wow.
I think we should bring back those helmets and those machetes. I think it's time for revival. I would love to have that.
I'm telling you.
No,
Yeah.
I'm playing in the wrong place. Oh, that's so great to hear. I also said I had so many questions with the Albania thing. I would love to have dived into, it's exciting, but it's difficult. Anyway, that's probably for another one. But what we also Tove mentioned about that you speak German and into the devotional in German. What's your history with Germany?
Well, I moved there in January of 1993 after that big outreach to Albania, and I joined the team. It was being led by Fraser and Punana Haug at the YWAM Hurlok base. And YWAM Hurlok had decided to adopt one region of Germany. Actually, it was YWAM Germany had made that decision, but the team was based in Hurlok. And so we adopted the Pogradets region, and so that was our project. And so that's what drew me to Germany. I really wanted to learn the language. I drove my roommates crazy. I came to Germany with my whole Berlitz cassette tape collection, learning German. And I would be in Albania. I was learning Albanian at the same time. So I'd go back and forth. I was learning both of them. But German, I actually went to language school for German. So I learned how to write it, speak it, read it. So it was just, I was in my 30s. It was just like this decade of the learning was just exploding, cross-cultural learning, language learning, field work in missions. I mean, it was it sounds exciting. It was also hard, but it was just like the classic things you often read, about how God calls people into missions and how he just starts teaching them so many things. I just was on a huge learning curve. Wow. And it was amazing.
Wow.
So good. With that, can I just ask a follow-up question here?
Sure.
So in your 30s, remember then late 20s, you went to Albania and you did Germany and language studies. And it's, as we're telling our stories in YWAM and inspiring young people, those are the things we're saying. But then it's also the things that it is quite difficult. And we find young people as they're moving into it, they find it a bit difficult to meet that resistance and stay with God or stay where they're at. Do you have any, what will be your tip for a 20, 25-year-old that is going to go to the equivalent of Albania today and do missions and knowing that it might be quite difficult? What would be the number one or the three things that would sustain you through that?
I think the first one is knowing that God has really called you into missions. I mean, that's like a marker in the ground. Mm-hmm. When it got tough, there were, oh my goodness. There were days I cried and cried. Trying to learn another language is really challenging. I would go to church, German church, and I couldn't talk to anybody, and I'd go back and pretend like I was reading the bulletin board, because I didn't know what else to do. And, and it was, and then, raising the finances, getting used to another culture. I had experienced a lot of culture shock, but I would say, first of all, knowing that God called you. That's like you look back and you see those markers. You're like, well, Lord, I know that you called me. So no matter how hard it is, I know that this is your plan for me. Secondly, not to be a lone ranger, that you really need team, and you need people that are around you that have a common calling and vision. I mean, all of our work into Albania was team-based. And so we did everything as a team. We lived together when we were in Albania. We lived close to one another in the village in Germany. We were all doing language learning together. We would laugh about our mistakes. We would cry, over the situations that were so hard in Albania. But we did it as a team, and so that was a tremendous strength. So, and then I just think that, the Lord strengthens us, and in those difficult places, he's building spiritual muscle. And that is part of his shaping, his forming in our lives. And so the difficulties are going to be there. You cannot escape them. And many times they are quite painful, but the Lord is with us and he's shaping us. I would say that's what I would say to young people. And I would say also, don't lose the joy of the journey. I remember being on an airplane flight one time coming back from Africa. I also worked in West Africa, and I was sitting next to this older woman in her 70s. I was in my 30s or early 40s. And I found out she had been a long-term missionary to West Africa, to Guinea-Bissau. And I asked her, I said, hey, what advice would you give a young person like myself? And she said, don't forget to laugh. She said, keep your sense of humor. She said, don't get all serious all the time. She said, you got to keep it real. And I'll never forget that.
Fantastic. This is maybe going back again, but Johan, have you heard Camille tell something about her leaving home with a little suitcase, or how was it again? There's something.
No, I have not heard.
You haven't?
I hear it though.
I don't know. It just came to me now. There's something about you. Was that as a kid that you already then knew that you were going to be a teacher? What is it about the suitcase?
Oh no, that was a briefcase.
Briefcase. That's what I meant. Sorry.
I was 12 years old. I carried a briefcase to school. I wouldn't recommend it.
For all you young people out there that are listening, do not bring a briefcase.
I don't recommend it. It doesn't do anything for your social life. But the teachers loved it. The teachers loved it.
It was because you wanted to be a teacher, because you're so focused.
I was so focused. I just love to learn. I've always loved to learn, and I was serious about it. So I carried a briefcase. But like I said, it didn't do much for my social life.
Right. I do want to bridge from the briefcase then to, you are not just Camille Bishop, but you are Dr. Bishop. You're an educator, professor, author. What made you then pursue further studies then as well, not just as a little one?
Great question. Really it was being in Albania, because it was so thought-provoking to me. I mean, here we were working in this amazing place, very isolated place, very difficult place. I remember meeting with teachers in Albania and it was soon after the regime had collapsed. And I said, you're free now. What would you do differently in education? Nobody said a word. I said, no, you're free. I mean, I was very naive, very American. I said, you're free, brainstorm. What would you do differently? How would you rearrange your curriculum? And they said that nothing. Finally, one woman said to me, Camille, you have no idea what you're saying. She said, we don't know what the future holds, and we would have been sent to prison for asking any of the questions you're asking us right now. How do we know the regime's not going to come back again in 3 months? And so I was confronted with my own naivete, about cross-cultural issues. What does it really look like to say you're going to form a Christian education system? I would go to the school I was working in, and the teachers would greet one another and be so nice to each other, but they would ignore the cleaning lady. There was all this racism and socioeconomic levels. And it was like, and I remember praying and saying, Lord, what would you do? And he said, Camille, I want you to greet the cleaning lady as the first person you meet every single day. and here's the cleaning lady on her hands and knees with these, as in winter time, broken, her hands are all cracked, she's using a rag to clean the floor, the water's cold, and nobody, she was like she was a ghost. Nobody paid any attention to her. And so I started greeting her first thing every morning, just to create a different culture. But, how do you see that change? That was my big question. How do you see that culture change? And so I had so many questions. And then after 5 years, there was actually a civil uprising in Albania in 1997. And all the missionaries were literally thrown out. I mean, they came to our front door with machine guns. People had broken into the armory. They had machine guns and grenades, and they just said, "Get out." I wasn't there at the time. I was in West Africa, but I heard it on the BBC underneath my mosquito net. I was listening to the BBC. And it cost $6 a minute to log on to CompuServe in Lisbon from Guinea-Bissau. And so I logged on just to hear what was happening with my team, and they had to flee. And so we were all of a sudden out of a job. And Tom Bloomer was studying at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and getting his doctorate. And so I talked with Tom, and he said, I'd really recommend it. So I started praying, and it seemed like the right time. And so I went and visited the university, and I told them what I'd been doing in Albania. I didn't even have all the qualifications to get in. And they said, because of your work in Albania, we'll take you. They said I had to do a few things to get in, but I mean, it was because of the field work in Albania. And so it prompted me to get into that study. And everybody in my program was a missionary. I was the only white person in the whole dorm. Wow. It was wonderful. So it just was like this segue, from the field back into the classroom, but with the purpose of taking that learning and going back into the field. And everybody else in my program felt the same. So the motivation for learning was super high. It wasn't to make money. It wasn't to get a name for myself. It was to be able to be more effective in serving in missions. And it served its purpose.
Wow, that sounds like the right, motivation for any education. I think it's a Tom Bloomer maybe that says that the end goal of all education is love. Is that him saying that?
Yes, yeah, it's right. It's relationship.
Yeah. Now, what did you study, Camille? I mean,
well, my degree was in educational studies, but it was kind of like the master's cohort that you and Johan have been a part of. It was education at the center, but then we looked at it through all these different prisms like theology, psychology, history, philosophy, world missions. So it was very dynamic. And it was being led by some top-notch missions educators like Ted Ward, who had actually, given advice into YWAM about the University of the Nations. And some of my other professors had served overseas for many years with training people. And so I just felt very privileged. And I want to just tell one other story. If God's calling you into further education, I want you to encourage you, believe the Lord for miracles. I said to the Lord, I do not want to come out with 1 penny of debt because I want to go back into missions. I don't want to come out with thousands of dollars of debt. I started it, I took one class at a time as I could afford it. After I had done that for a few times, I was out in Kona and I got an email from the director of the program and said, Camille, we'd like to offer you a full scholarship.
Oh,
I never applied for it. I never even knew it existed. I started shaking all over. And it was the Lord's provision for me to get that doctorate. I didn't owe a penny when I was done. It was financially, it was very tight, I lived very frugally, but I didn't owe a penny when I finished.
Wow. That's a testimony.
That's beautiful. So how has it's been a benefit for you in ministry, obviously doing this. Talk a little bit, what are some of the benefits? Like what fruit has it carried and how has God worked through it and so on?
I mean, so many, that's a great question, Johan. So much, so many things. First of all, it opened the world in another dimension to me, because in a lot of countries, they want the credentials. So I've now, after I finished that, I was able to work into the Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, into Central Asia, into China, doing teacher training. But they wanted to know that they wanted the credential. They wanted to know that people had a doctorate. And so it opened doors for me to teach more broadly, to invest in a lot of teachers in Africa as well. So Africa, Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, Central Asia, into India. So it just opened doors. I began to see the Lord, and he does this for many YWAMers, you know, that we often interact with people in other mission agencies. And so I had the opportunity to work with other groups in training as well. And so it was a door opener. And it strengthened my work within YWAM. That's about 4 years after I graduated, was when Maureen began to start formulating this master's program in Christian formation and discipleship. And I helped her pioneer that with other people like LaPrelle and others. And my graduate studies helped me form and shape that program. So I would say, I look back, I go, wow, Lord, that's amazing. Not only that, but it also enabled me to teach online for some other organizations and universities. And, you know, money helps. So
That's great.
It brought in some extra income, you know, so it's perfect.
Excellent.
That's so good. And another fruit of your studies was a book, right? So what's it called? We are in this boat together.
I just happen to have a copy.
Oh, yeah.
That's amazing.
We're in this boat together. Leadership succession between the generations. Yeah.
Tell us more about it. What was the reason for it? How did it come about?
That was what I did my dissertation about. It was on leadership transition in organizations, looking at culture and generations. And so I did my study within the University of the Nations. I interviewed 39 leaders in the University of the Nations, including Tove. And I had 19 different cultures, men and women. And I asked people about the leadership transition within our own mission. The reason I did it was because I thought, wow, we're going to go through a lot of transitions in the coming years. It burdened me. I thought, how are we going to do it well? And so I wanted to study it, you know, so I looked at organizational development, organizational transition. I studied generations. I studied culture and how they perceived leadership. And then when I got it all done and graduated, I thought, well, nobody reads dissertations unless you're working on one. So I've got to do something to get it out to the general public. So I was reading a book by Patrick Lencioni called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, and he wrote it as a business fiction book. And I thought, I could do that. And so I wrote this book as a business fiction book, but it's filled with principles that I learned in my studies. And the bibliography comes from the dissertation. And at the end, I did a case study of the leadership transition from George Verwer to Peter Maiden in Operation Mobilization. George Verwer stepped aside intentionally when he was in his 60s, he intentionally stepped aside and started passing over the leadership. And so anyway, I had fun writing it, and I've been able to use it to do some training with different groups within the mission and outside of the mission.
It's very good.
You can still get it on Amazon Kindle.
There's a lot of leadership transition going on in so many places. So maybe it needs to be, I don't know, relaunched or something. I've
thought about the same thing. Relaunching it, adding in a couple of more generations, because
seriously,
the question doesn't go away.
Yeah.
So true.
So is there anything, I mean, like, again, on this topic, actually, that is the topic for the month, for the ELC, there's LD Access, these short videos as well. So the focus is passing the baton, but is there what vision, not what wisdom would you have to share with us just right now? I mean, is there like a one thing that, you know, in order to do that well?
Well, let me just say this. Out of the 39 people I interviewed in our mission 20 years ago, only one person said we did it well. So the research kind of speaks for itself, you know. And I don't say that as a negative. I mean, I talked to a lot of the, you know, the pioneering leaders of our mission, and they were living in a time where you just did the best you could, you know. I had one couple share with me that literally their leadership transition was they were driving out of the driveway of the base they were leading, and the new couple was driving up the driveway, and they just stopped and opened their windows and passed the cash box over and then kept on going.
I mean, as the person leaving, that would have sounded amazing.
And I'm like, oh my gosh, but that was, you know, they were pioneering. They had just literally rolled out maps and said, I'll take Germany, I'll take France, I'll take Italy. I mean, it was one of those times, right?
Yeah.
But I think that, you know, when I did my research, I really found in the research that good transitions are possible. They are possible, but they have to be deliberate. And so I think some of the things, the 4 key principles that I talked about in the book were, it needs to be intentional. You know, you need to be thinking about it, not leaving it to a crisis mode where it just happens, you know, and you don't know what it's going to look like. You know, I've been a person that took over for someone, and it was so quickly done, and I didn't really know what was expected of me. You know, nothing had really been very much communicated. All of a sudden I was the new leader. It's hard for the leader, it's hard for the people, you know, so it needs to be more intentional. I think also communication. You know, don't make last minute decisions. You just get up and announce it and you create your new flow chart, but nobody's ever heard about it before. They never thought it was coming, and they're just sitting there going, what? You know, what does that mean for me? What is going to happen to me? What's going to happen to the base? You know, so I just think that being intentional, thinking about your people, they have emotions and feelings too. Transition impacts everybody, and you cannot really over communicate. You know, we make assumptions, you know, we make way too many assumptions that people understand and people, you know what we're doing, but they don't. So those are some of the things I would say.
So you're just out of interest here, for you with a bit of experience, what's too quick and what's good? What's a good time?
Well, I mean, you know, for example, when, you know, George Verwer decided to step aside, you know, he was the founder, you know, and leader of Operation Mobilization. It was a 5-year process, but he already had his eye on someone and decided to work with him, and then communicated it to the organization, and they were all kind of walking it through together. So, you know, I think the time frame varies on what kind of a leadership position it is. If you're leading a school, you know, that's different from leading a base. That's different from leading an area circle team, or, you know, or if you've founded a ministry. So I think the time frame will vary, but I think the principles are the same. What's the vision? You know, we would call it the DNA. How are you going to protect the DNA? How are you going to do this transition well, so that people are not falling through the cracks, but they know what's happening? And then also, what happens to the person who's leaving that? Often it's very awkward. You know, people have been leading a base, now they're not, but they're still there. You know, well, what does that feel like for them? You know, how do they still stay in the community, but they're not involved in the day-to-day decision making? That's very difficult for people. People have to come to terms with the result of transition can affect your identity. Who am I now that I'm not the base leader? Who am I now that I'm not on the area circle team? You know, I mean, we say that that our identity is not tied to our work, but that's an illusion.
You find out when you step off.
Yeah, it's an illusion. We do it, and it's almost subconscious.
of course, I'm sure that.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that?
Yeah,
Sure.
please.
So with that, because I agree, like you're definitely disillusioned when you worked on something for a long time and then you don't. But would that be different from having your identity tied to it versus recognizing that you've done something for a long time and now you need to readjust? Because in my head, those are slightly different. Like my identity will lead me into a life crisis versus me shifting roles. It leads me into maybe more of a temporary crisis of finding my feet again.
Yeah, I think that's a nuance, Johan, that's very accurate. I mean, that's why I titled the book, We're in the Boat Together. You can find another place in the boat. You know, it's not about tossing somebody out of the boat, right? And I think leadership transition is a lot about that. Should we shift the roles, you know? But it takes mature people to shift the roles without moving into an identity crisis. But I think that often in the midst of transition, for example, personally, I just resigned from being on the international leadership team for the University of the Nations. It was a painful decision for me. It took me 2 years to make the decision. And then when I made it, I thought, oh my goodness, I realized my identity was more involved than I thought it was. And I am finding new roles and new ways to be in the boat. But to be honest, yeah, I mean, I've had to work through some of those things, but I think it's true. It's not the same for every person, and it is a nuance there.
Yeah. Good. I was just thinking that I'm sure that both Johan and I are also sitting thinking of our transitions we have been involved with, including all the viewers. Yeah.
Want to come here and consult would be great.
Yeah. I'm actually sitting on a base right now here that I'm visiting this week. I was here when the last transition happened. And this is one of the only places I know where there's been a really good, solid transition, and all 3 generations of leaders are still involved in some level or living in the area. So quite impressive. But Camille, So Camille, I was thinking, from your own experience, of course, there's this more recent one, but have you experienced a bad one done badly? And then another side question with that is, how do you guard your heart when it's done badly? Since it's 9 out of 10, you said before.
Yeah, those are great questions. Yes, I have walked through some bad transitions. And I found them bad transitions. I found them very painful. And sometimes depending on the level of upheaval, you know, because sometimes transitions, they're not just a poor transition, they literally can lead to an upheaval. And broken relationships. I remember going through one, and my gosh, people on the base didn't speak to each other for months.
Yeah.
It's truly sad. And I remember I just went through all the stages of grief. You know, first I was in shock, then I was in denial, then I was mad, you know, then I was depressed. You know, I remember one time going through a transition that was so painful, and I was listening to this U2 song. What's it called? I'm stuck in the moment and I can't get out of it. I sang it over and over and over again. And one time I went out and I started screaming in the parking lot. I mean, I just, you know, I went through the whole range, you know. I think first of all, I really think when you go through transition, it's important not to just try and ignore it and like it goes like a U, you know, like this. And a lot of times people will just take some dirt and fill in that gap and just pretend like nothing happened. They just skate from one thing to another just to try to get over it. You have to go through the process because it's healthy. You know, I came out the other end hopeful again and found a new place and found my feet again, but it was a process. And you don't linger in it more than you need to, but if you go through the process, and you do have to guard your heart. And I was thinking about that this morning. I think probably one of the most dangerous things is to become cynical. And it, you know, of course, we go through a range of emotions. You can be angry, disillusioned, mad, bitter, all kinds of things. But cynicism does something. It's like an anger in the heart that's not been dealt with, and it comes out as cynicism, even in our humor. And I remember Dean Sherman telling me years ago, Camille, guard against cynicism. And he said that was something he had to deal with, because when hard things happen, especially in a mission that you love and in a mission that says we're family and it's all about relationships, when transitions don't go well, it can really lead you into cynicism. You have to guard your heart and work through the forgiveness. It doesn't happen quickly. Sometimes it takes time.
Yeah, that's very good input.
Yeah, it's very good. How do you maybe you've gone through that yourself, the journey of cynicism, and if so, like, how do you discern the difference between cynicism and like appropriate criticism? Because the reality is usually when we're going through these things, bitterness, cynicism, anger, like we all feel justified in those things, and that's kind of the catch-22 where we're kind of, it spins down, but it needs to break through sometime. And it's what will be some self-reflective things that you would say to someone to discern the difference?
I would say, great question, Johan. I would say, listen to the words that come out of your mouth. I've been in situations where I heard myself say something, and I thought, oh gosh, Camille, that's so cynical. I would say also ask people that you trust, people that are good friends, to say, hey, look, I really want to ask you honestly, are you hearing me? Are you hearing me being cynical? What do you think? And I've had friends say, Camille, you are still bitter about that. You've got to deal with it. So listen to what's coming out of your mouth, because it says, out of the heart, the mouth speaks. Listen to yourself. Have some good friends that you can really be honest and open with. Take it to the Lord. I mean, it's easy to say that, but but how do you do it? Well, you just get with the Lord and say, hey, I am just really angry. I'm still angry, and help me to forgive. I catch myself being cynical. I don't want to be like that. Jesus, please help me. You just think about all the opportunities Jesus would have had to have become cynical. Judas, all the accusations, the false accusations about him, the way that people just, sometimes he would say, don't tell anybody, and they'd run out and tell everybody. All the things that would have happened to him that could have led to terrible disillusionment, cynicism. I know the disciples went through it, because you can see it, in their lives. So I think it's something we all have to deal with.
Yeah. I think a question that kind of goes alongside with that, potentially at least, in all our lounges, we always ask this question, and that's because the mistake question. I just want to hear if there's a mistake that you have done it could be in transition, but just in leadership, that you like to share that we all could learn from. Yeah.
Great question. I've made lots.
Just pick one, Camille, just one.
I think one of the biggest mistakes I ever made was working in a project in West Africa where we were partnering with a Portuguese-speaking Brazilian team that had pioneered the work there, and they wanted to do some work in Christian education. It was a fantastic opportunity, and I wanted to join them with some people from Germany to help them. And a couple of years, they invited me down to do like a teacher training conference with them. It was just wonderful, and I loved it. And then they invited us, hey, why don't you move here, and we'll join forces and we'll work with the Ministry of Education, who's open to doing teacher training in Guinea-Bissau. And it was like this amazing opportunity. And I had this little thought inside of me, like, I don't know how well it's going to go, because the cultures were so different. The Brazilian culture and leadership is very different than German and American leadership styles. But we had so much encouragement. We had all of our notebooks filled with promises and scriptures. But I remember asking my leader one day, what if it doesn't go well? What if we don't lead well together? And it was kind of like, we just kind of overlooked it and said, well, I made the assumption that because we were all YWAMers, we all loved Jesus, we'd all done a DTS, everything would be okay. Everything did not go okay. The cultural differences, the leadership styles were so very different, hierarchical versus egalitarian, misunderstandings, miscommunications. It got bigger and bigger and bigger. And finally, the project fell apart. And it was a horrible disappointment. I had to go back to Germany, and my team and I had to go back to Germany and go back to churches that were supporting us and explain why it fell apart. And then later, as I unpacked, I was so angry at the time. I was angry at the Brazilian leader. And over time, as I began to think about it more, process it more with the Lord, I just realized I made a false assumption. And instead of really looking honestly at what would it really look like to co-lead a team like that, it could have been done differently. It could have been done much differently. And I was humbled by the mistakes that I had made. So that's probably my biggest one. And I think it's not uncommon.
Not at all. Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that.
Yes, it's very good. And it's always stuff to learn as we're working cross-culturally. It's always things to hash out and to be good listeners to one another. It's very good. Yeah. But having a doctor's degree and other things, you've read a couple of books, maybe one or two. But help us. What are some golden ones, some gems that you want to recommend that leaders should read?
I'll tell you, I sent a list to Tove last night. Some of the ones I've read in the last year that have really impacted me. One was The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer. That book just absolutely gripped me. And the reason is because he was so honest. He starts his book out by saying, I've preached 6 times this weekend. I don't remember the last 2 times what I said. I'm in an Uber headed home. I'm exhausted. I get home. My wife and my kids are already in bed. I open a beer. I turn on some kung fu movie, and I'm looking at myself and I'm like, what happened to me? I feel like a ghost. I feel like I'm hollowed out on the inside. I'm performing well, but I'm not doing well. And he made the amazing decision of leaving the situation he was in, a multi-site church, and he went and took the leadership of a much smaller church. The courage that it took for someone to do that. And he's in his early 40s, I think. And they just talked about how to get out of the trap of always being in a hurry, and then some of the things that he did to eliminate hurry. That really spoke to me. That was during the COVID time when we were all shut down and I had more time to really think, process, read. That book really spoke to me because leaders, it's challenging. As leaders, we can perform well and be empty on the inside. That's dangerous.
Yeah.
I'll just say it out loud. It's dangerous. We've seen so many failings in the body of Christ, top leaders, and you're thinking these guys have published books, they're speaking all over the world, and they got some secret thing going on in their life and nobody knows it. And then it gets exposed, right? So it's dangerous to live like that. And then the other book I've most recently read was called The Deeply Formed Life by Rich Villodas, pastor of a very multi-ethnic church up in New York City. And he was also just talking about taking the time to be deeply formed in Christ, not overcommitting, managing our lives better, looking at our families, the other people in our lives, our friends, and how things are really going. So those 2 really have shaped me. Then I read G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy book recently in a book club. Really hard read, but refreshing. He was just looking at worldview through the lens of a journalist, and his humor and what he discovered about God just really encouraged me. Another idea I have is, how do I take something like G.K. Chesterton and make it relevant for the younger generation? Because very few of them, I think, are going to struggle through orthodoxy.
So
anyway.
you're thinking of writing a worldview book, like easy to go to?
I am.
Yeah,
I am.
Please do.
So those are some of my thoughts. And also I've been a group called Renovare, which is started by Richard Foster here in the States, but they have an international reach. Been joined a book club with them. They read a lot of interesting books, and then also that their podcasts have been inspiring. So yeah, those are some of the gems, most recent ones.
Brilliant. We will make sure to put them on Facebook as well as into the our book list on the ELC. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Well, what do you think, Johan? Are you I was gonna say revived now or enlightened now by Camille?
Great. I have so many questions.
Yeah.
I would love to have this conversation go on a bit more detail and a bit more,
Yeah.
but it's not the time and place, which is good.
Yeah.
So,
It's been wonderful, Camille. So thank you so much for taking your time. And we look forward to seeing your refreshed book of We Are in This Boat Together, with a few more chapters, right? And then a new worldview book, or maybe worldview podcast. I don't know. Maybe you should consider that.
Yeah, I never thought about that.
Yeah, there you go. It's for free.
Your podcast.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe we could do some stuff together.
Okay, I'm in for it.
I love it. I would love it.
Yeah. Okay, let's do it.
All right. Hey, I want to say thank you, Tove and Johan, for facilitating this morning. I feel very honored to have been asked. And having lived in Europe, I have a very special heart for Europe and the work that our mission is doing there. And I appreciate both of you very much. And so thank you so much for all who you are and what you're doing in the kingdom, and for hosting this. It's been great. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Camille. You can always bring your briefcase over here. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you for now, and love to talk more another time.
Okay.
Maybe we could host you another time again. Yeah.
Take good care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye now.